Hathor, Astarte, and Freyja, a timeline of three goddesses. Before 3000 BCE, the world before Hathor. Long before Hathor's name appears clearly in Egyptian writing, cattle already held enormous symbolic importance throughout northeastern Africa. Predynastic Egyptian artwork contains images of cows, cow horns, celestial symbols, and powerful female figures. Some of these images resemble symbols that would later belong to Hathor. That does not prove that every prehistoric cow image represents Hathor. Egypt's early religious world contained several bovine goddesses, including Bat, whose appearance and symbolism would eventually overlap with Hathor's. What these early objects demonstrate is that Hathor did not emerge from nowhere. She developed within a culture that already associated cattle with nourishment, motherhood, wealth, the heavens, and protective feminine power. Around 2700 to 2200 BCE, Hathor takes her place. During Egypt's Old Kingdom, Hathor becomes a recognizable and increasingly important goddess. Her name is commonly interpreted as House of Horus. This could describe the sky as the divine house through which the falcon god Horus travels. It could also connect Hathor with the king, because the living pharaoh was closely associated with Horus. Hathor could be depicted as a cow, as a woman with cow ears, or as a woman wearing horns surrounding a solar disk. But she was never merely a cow goddess. Hathor became a goddess of music, dance, intoxication, sexuality, fertility, motherhood, beauty, and joy. She could protect women during childbirth and welcome people into celebration. She also possessed royal and celestial authority. Depending on the location and period, she could be described as the mother, wife, or daughter of important male gods. This flexibility was not necessarily considered a contradiction. Egyptian deities existed through overlapping local traditions, religious titles, and divine relationships. Around 2200 to 2000 BCE, Hathor welcomes the dead. As Egyptian funerary traditions developed, Hathor acquired an increasingly important place in the afterlife. She was called the Mistress of the West. The West was where the sun disappeared each evening and where many Egyptian cemeteries were constructed. Hathor could therefore appear as a goddess emerging from the western mountains to receive the deceased. This introduced a theme that will return with both Astarte and Freyja. The goddess of sexuality and life was also connected with death. That was not an ancient contradiction. The power that brings human beings into the world can also receive them when life ends. Around 2000 BCE, the Great Lady of Dendera. By the Middle Kingdom, Hathor's cult was firmly established at Dendera, one of her most important religious centers. Priests served her. Kings dedicated objects to her. Rituals celebrated her through music, movement, and the shaking of the sistrum, a sacred rattle closely associated with her worship. Hathor was also called the Mistress of Turquoise. Egyptian expeditions traveling into the Sinai Peninsula sought valuable minerals under her protection. She became a guardian of miners, travelers, desert territories, and the precious materials brought back to Egypt. This was another side of Hathor that the simplified title, Goddess of Love, fails to capture. She governed beauty, but she was also connected with the dangerous labor and distant expeditions required to obtain beautiful things. Around 1800 to 1500 BCE, Astarte rises in the Levant. While Hathor's worship flourished in Egypt, another powerful goddess was emerging more clearly in the cultures of the ancient Levant. Her name was Astarte, or Ashtart. Astarte belonged to the religious world of Canaanites, Phoenicians, and other West Semitic peoples. Her history is related to the broader family of Near Eastern goddesses that included the Mesopotamian Ishtar and the earlier Inanna. Related does not mean identical. Astarte developed her own identities within different cities and kingdoms. She was associated with sexuality, fertility, royal power, horses, hunting, and warfare. Images identified with Astarte sometimes depict a nude female figure, emphasizing sexuality and fertility. Other traditions present her as an armed and commanding goddess. Once again, love and war occupied the same divine body. Around 1550 to 1300 BCE, Hathor and Astarte enter the same world. During Egypt's New Kingdom, Egyptian armies and political influence extended deeply into the Levant. This brought Egyptian religion into closer contact with Canaanite deities. Astarte, Anat, Reshef, Baal, and other foreign gods entered Egyptian religious life. Astarte became especially associated with horses, chariots, warfare, and the military power of the pharaoh. This is where our comparison becomes more than thematic. Hathor and Astarte were now known within the same civilization. Egyptians did not necessarily erase the distinction between them. Instead, their religious system could recognize similarities while preserving different names, origins, cults, and functions. Astarte could serve the Egyptian king as a foreign warrior goddess. Hathor remained one of Egypt's great native divine powers. They could overlap without becoming interchangeable. Around 1350 BCE, the Amarna Revolution. During the reign of Akhenaten, Egypt's established religious order came under attack. Akhenaten elevated the Aten, represented by the solar disk, while closing temples and suppressing the images and names of other gods. Images of Hathor were among those deliberately damaged. The revolution did not last. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt restored its traditional gods. Hathor returned to public worship, demonstrating that divine traditions could survive even a king's attempt to erase them. Around 1274 BCE, Astarte and the royal war machine under Ramesses II, Astarte's military identity became particularly appropriate to Egyptian royal ideology. The pharaoh's horses and chariots represented speed, control, and devastating battlefield power. Foreign warrior deities helped express Egypt's authority over territories beyond the Nile Valley. Astarte was not simply imported as a goddess of romance. She entered Egypt carrying the force of horses, chariots, and foreign war. Around 1200 to 500 BCE, Astarte crosses the Mediterranean. The collapse of several Bronze Age kingdoms transformed the eastern Mediterranean. But Astarte did not disappear. Phoenician merchants and settlers carried their languages, customs, and gods across maritime trade routes. Worship of Astarte reached Cyprus, North Africa, and settlements throughout the Mediterranean. One of her most important Western centers developed at Carthage. As Astarte moved, her identity encountered local goddesses and new religious systems. In different places, she could be compared or blended with Anat, Ishtar, Aphrodite, Tanit, and other female divinities. These identifications were never perfectly consistent. Ancient religious exchange did not operate like a clean family tree. It resembled a web of shared symbols, borrowed titles, translated names, and political relationships. Around 700 to 300 BCE, Hathor and Isis overlap. During the later centuries of Egyptian religion, Isis grew into an increasingly universal goddess. Isis absorbed or shared several qualities long associated with Hathor: divine motherhood, royal protection, the solar disk between cow horns, music, sexuality, and the nurturing of Horus. Hathor did not immediately vanish. Their cults existed together, and Egyptian worshippers could recognize both goddesses. Over time, however, Isis became more internationally successful. Her worship traveled throughout the Greek and Roman worlds, while Hathor remained more closely tied to Egypt and particular sacred centers such as Dendera. Around 500 BCE to 300 CE, Astarte becomes. Many goddesses, Greek and Roman writers often interpreted foreign gods by comparing them with their own. Astarte was commonly associated with Aphrodite and later Venus. This helped make her understandable to outsiders, but it also reduced her complexity. The warrior, royal, and political dimensions of Astarte could disappear behind the more familiar image of a goddess of sexual attraction. Astarte's name also entered biblical traditions, usually in a hostile form. Biblical authors condemned the worship of foreign goddesses, and the plural term Ashtaroth became associated with forbidden religious practices. Over later centuries, this hostility contributed to another transformation. Astarte, the ancient goddess, was increasingly confused with Astaroth, a male demon found in medieval and early modern demonology. A goddess was not merely forgotten, she was rewritten as something evil. Around 400 to 700 CE, the distant roots of Freyja far to the north, Germanic religious traditions were developing through oral culture. The exact origins of Freyja remain debated. Her surviving stories suggest connections with older Germanic ideas concerning fertility, prophecy, magic, sexuality, wealth, and sovereignty. Scholars also continue debating the relationship between Freyja and Frigg. The two goddesses share certain characteristics, and their names possess related meanings. They may preserve aspects of an older divine figure, or they may have always been distinct goddesses whose traditions occasionally overlapped. The surviving evidence does not allow a final answer. Around 750 to 1050 CE, Freyja in the Viking Age. During the Viking Age, Freyja became one of the most important goddesses of the Norse world. Her name means lady. She belonged to the Vanir, a divine family strongly associated with fertility, prosperity, nature, and supernatural knowledge. After the war between the Vanir and the Aesir, Freyja lived among the Aesir gods. She was connected with love, sexual desire, fertility, wealth, gold, magic, warfare, and death. Her most famous possession was Brisingan, a magnificent necklace whose meaning and origin survived through several different stories. She also possessed a falcon feather cloak that allowed its wearer to travel through the air. She rode in a chariot drawn by cats and was associated with a boar called Hildisvini. Like Hathor, Freyja was connected with precious materials, beauty, and desire. Like Astarte, she could not be separated from warfare. Around 900 to 1000 CE, the goddess who receives the slain Norse poetry describes Freyja as the ruler of Folkvanger, the field of the people. According to the surviving tradition, Freyja receives half of those who fall in battle. Odin receives the other half. Modern popular culture frequently places nearly every honored Norse warrior in Valhalla. The actual mythology presents a more complicated afterlife. Freyja was not standing outside the warrior tradition. She possessed her own domain among the dead. The goddess of love was also a chooser and receiver of the slain. Around 1000 CE, Christianity gradually replaced the public worship of the Norse gods. Temples, sacred sites, rituals, and oral traditions changed or disappeared. Freyja survived in stories, place names, folklore, and cultural memory, but no single complete account of her ancient worship was preserved. Similar transformations had already overtaken Hathor and Astarte. Christianity ended the public temple traditions that had sustained their worship. Later cultural changes further separated local populations from the ancient religious systems. The goddesses survived, but primarily as memories, literary figures, archaeological discoveries, or condemned remnants of older religions. The 13th century, Freyja is written down. Much of what we know about Freyja comes from works recorded after Scandinavia had become Christian. The Poetic Edda preserves poems derived from older oral traditions. The Prose Edda, associated with the Icelandic writer Snorri Sturluson, organizes and explains many Norse myths. These texts preserve Freyja's hall, her necklace, her missing husband, her tears of gold, her magical knowledge, and the repeated attempts of giants to claim her as a bride. But these sources are not untouched transcripts of Viking Age religion. They are medieval records of older stories, written in a changed religious world. The 18th and 19th centuries, the goddesses returned European archaeology, translation, colonial collecting, and romantic art brought ancient gods back into public consciousness. Egyptian temples and inscriptions renewed interest in Hathor. Phoenician artifacts helped reconstruct Astarte's history. Translations of Norse literature returned Freyja to poetry, painting, and scholarship. This rediscovery came with distortions. Hathor could be presented as an exotic symbol of pleasure. Astarte became an allegedly mysterious Eastern goddess. Freyja was frequently transformed into a pale, delicate medieval princess. The goddesses returned, but modern societies often remade them in their own image. The 20th century, the age of the love goddess, popular mythology books classified deities through simple categories. Hathor became the Egyptian goddess of love. Astarte became the Phoenician goddess of fertility. Freyja became the Norse goddess of beauty. These descriptions were not completely wrong. They were simply much too small. They removed Hathor's relationship with kingship, foreign lands, solar violence, and death. They minimized Astarte's horses, weapons, and political authority. They obscured Freyja's magic, wealth, independence, and claim upon the battlefield dead. Three complicated divine powers were reduced to ancient versions of Valentine's Day, 1963, and after. Freyja enters Marvel's Asgard. Marvel Comics incorporated versions of numerous Norse gods into its fictional Asgard. Its treatment of Freyja has not always followed the medieval sources closely. At different times, Marvel has blended names and characteristics belonging to Freyja and Frigg. That confusion reflects a genuine scholarly question, but popular entertainment often turns uncertainty into one simplified character. Marvel helped introduce Norse mythology to enormous modern audiences. It also demonstrated how readily ancient identities can be rearranged to serve a new fictional universe. The late 20th century, religious revival Hathor, Astarte, and Freyja began returning not only as fictional characters, but as objects of active devotion. Kemetic reconstructionists sought to rebuild religious practices based on ancient Egyptian evidence. Modern heathens renewed the worship of Norse deities. Other pagan and goddess-centered traditions adopted Hathor, Astarte, and Freyja through modern rituals. These revivals do not reproduce the ancient world perfectly. That would be impossible. Modern worshippers live in different societies, speak different languages, and approach the goddesses through surviving fragments. But the return of active devotion means these figures are no longer confined to museums and mythology books. 2002 to the present, Freyja in modern games. Freyja has become especially visible in video games. She appears in Age of Mythology and Smite, while the God of War series reimagines her as a major dramatic character. The modern God of War interpretation combines Freyja with elements associated with Frigg. It presents her as a mother, queen, magician, warrior, political victim, enemy, and eventual ally. Although this is not a historically exact portrait, it restores something popular culture often removes. Freyja is allowed to be emotionally complicated, politically powerful, loving, violent, wounded, and dangerous at the same time. 2016, Hathor returns to the cinema. The film Gods of Egypt presented Hathor as a major character associated with love and the world of the dead. The film freely transformed Egyptian mythology into fantasy entertainment. Its casting and visual world generated justified criticism, especially because African deities were placed inside a heavily Europeanized version of Egypt. Yet the film also demonstrated Hathor's continuing narrative power. Thousands of years after her temples flourished, she could still appear as a goddess who moves between sexuality, divine politics, danger, and death. The 21st century, Astarte's fragmented survival Astarte appears throughout modern fantasy, games, comics, occult literature, music, and historical fiction. But her identity remains less stable than those of Hathor or Freyja. Sometimes she is represented as an ancient goddess. Sometimes she is merged with Ishtar. Sometimes she becomes another name for Aphrodite. In darker fantasy and occult works, she may be confused with the demon Astaroth. Her modern afterlife reveals how mythology can preserve a name while losing the person who originally carried it. Astarte survives everywhere and nowhere, recognizable but constantly transformed. Today, three goddesses reconstructed Hathor, Astarte, and Freyja now exist simultaneously in scholarship, religion, entertainment, art, games, and online culture. Hathor is being reclaimed as far more than a smiling cow goddess. Astarte is being separated from centuries of demonization and careless identification with other Near Eastern goddesses. Freyja is being restored as more than a beautiful Norse woman waiting to be married. None of them can be reduced to love. Hathor represents pleasure that can heal, intoxicate, protect, or become destructive. Astarte represents desire joined with royal and military power. Freyja represents love joined with magic, wealth, grief, independence, and authority over the dead. They were not one goddess traveling through three civilizations. Their histories do not form a single straight line. What connects them is something more revealing. Across different times and cultures, human beings repeatedly imagined feminine divine power as the force that creates life, inspires desire, grants authority, enters battle, practices magic, mourns what has been lost, and finally receives the dead. These goddesses did not survive because history preserved them unchanged. They survived because every new age rebuilt them, sometimes faithfully, sometimes carelessly, and sometimes almost beyond recognition. But beneath every reconstruction, the same warning remains. Never mistake the goddess of love for a harmless goddess.